It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you here this evening to perpetuate the memory of Leonard J. Arrington by furthering the scholarship he so loved through this Arrington Mormon History Lecture series. With particular pleasure and honor this evening, I introduce an award-winning historian whom Leonard Arrington embraced as a friend and highly esteemed as a scholar. Dr. Ronald W. Walker has been a conspicuous contributor to Western Utah and Mormon history for more than 4 decades. A past president of the Mormon History Association, he is the author or co-author of more than 5 scholarly articles and 9 books, the latest of which, co-edited with Matthew Grow and forthcoming from Oxford University Press, is a documentary collection of letters exchanged between Brigham Young and Thomas L. Paine. Just last month, Dr. Walker received the 2014 Dale L. Morgan Award for the best scholarly article appearing in the Utah Historical Quarterly, Buchanan, Popular Sovereignty, and the Mormons. This award is the latest in a series of awards Dr. Walker has received across the years, including, among others, 2 Best Book and 3 Best Article Awards from the Mormon History Association and the Smith-Pettit Award for Best Documentary History. It is no wonder that Leonard Arrington considered his colleague Ronald W. Walker to be one of the church's most sophisticated writers. Ron is a native of Missoula, Montana, and was raised in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and the San Joaquin Valley in California. He and his wife, Milani Midgley Walker, have made their home in Salt Lake City for the past 35 years. They are the very proud parents of 7 children and 15 grandchildren, and their lovely home is a gathering place not only for their large and lively family, but also for the colleagues and friends Ron and Lonnie frequently host with unparalleled graciousness. Ron holds degrees from Brigham Young University, Stanford University, and the University of Utah. He has worked as a senior research fellow, both for the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, and at the Smith Institute for Church History at Brigham Young University in Provo. At BYU, during his long tenure as professor of history, he served as a sterling mentor to the flock of research assistants who helped advance his various projects over the years. Ron has always had an ambitious writing agenda. So many books, so little time has been his familiar complaint. He has soothed this itch by writing. Extraordinarily careful and thorough data collection is a priority for him. His work with James B. Allen and David J. Whitaker on the massive Mormon Studies bibliography and companion historical analytical volume was a natural outgrowth of his commitment to knowing the sources. Ron has an uncanny ability to get inside primary sources, correspondence, minutes, diaries, reminiscences, and to ponder and parse the implications of their corroborations and inconsistencies. And Ron is a master of narrative. His Wayward Saints, the Godbeites in Brigham Young, and his Massacre at Mountain Meadows, co-authored with Richard E. Turley Jr. and Glenn M. Leonard, are richly textured histories that wrestle, no holds barred, with difficult issues and controversial characters, and thereby reveal the human condition in ways that both unsettle and reassure us. We will now have the privilege of listening to a fine gentleman and a superb scholar present the 20th Annual Leonard J. Arrington Mormon History Lecture, my friend and colleague, Ronald W. Walker, Heroes and Hero Worship, Brigham Young, and the Utah War.
My good friends, I am overwhelmed by the beauty of Ken's wonderful prayer and Martha's wonderful remarks from my dear friend. Some of you may know that I've had recently some health problems. And I don't know what that means. I think it means that I'm terminal, like the rest of you. But I may be here for another 10 or 15 years, but I may not. And I mention that because of the meaning that this event has for me. By the way, can you hear me? Yes, the microphone working. Everything seems richer and more meaningful and more beautiful. The sky looks bluer, the grass looks greener, and my friends dearer. And as part of my acknowledgement to friends, I certainly want to say something about my mentor and my dear friend Leonard. A giant and wonderful man, gentle, kind, and so much fun. So it is a particular honor for me tonight to reflect upon those things, reflect upon the beauty of life and the meaning of friends. Now, I had planned on explaining my title at the very end of my lecture. And I assumed that as I did that, you would be able to immediately grasp all the things that preceded it. But I don't think that works very well. So what I think I would like to do is begin with the end of my remarks. But we'll get back to those in a few minutes. The title of the presentation has something to do with heroes and hero worship. And there is a reciprocity between the two. The hero and those who follow and emulate. The phrase is taken from a book many of you will recognize. A path-breaking book of the 19th century, written by Thomas Carlyle, the great Scottish philosopher and intellectual. Carlyle went to university and lost his faith and spent much of the rest of his life trying to reclaim it. For several decades, in the middle of the 19th century, he published a series of books about biography and about great men, having to do with the hero and the hero worship. And I think I would like to begin tonight by page 1 of his book. He gets right at it. Now you have to listen very closely and carefully, because Carlyle is one of these wonderful intellectuals who had an unusual sense of style. So the sentences are inverted, the syntax is complex, the adjectives do not necessarily flow. You have to think what Carlyle is saying. A large topic indeed, he says, referring to heroes and hero worship. As wide as universal history itself. Then he tries to explain what he's saying. For I take it, universal history is the history of what has been accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of great men who have worked here. They were the forms, the molders, patterns, in a wide sense, creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in this world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization, and the embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in great men sent into the world. The soul of the world's history, it may justly be considered, for the history of these. Well, I think in a sense to reclaim his feelings of religion, he clothed the images of his great heroes with religious images. A true hero, Carlyle said, was a living light fountain who was pleasant to be near. They liked to be around. Who, as God's creation was, in communion with nature, the truth of all things. The hero was open to divine significance of life. Carlyle believed that the hero might come from life's regular ranks. Very interesting for it. So usually the schools, the academies, don't produce the great men. Upon achieving distinction, the hero remained, quote, simple, austere, full of purpose, sincere, assured, and sometimes even combative. Carlyle's hero is the exceptional man, and I think we're talking about gender neutral here. The exceptional man or woman, so different in degree from the rest of us that he almost seems different in type. All right, so to summarize, Carlyle had a theory of history, and his history was that the producers of great events were great men. Now, I need to tell you, Carlyle has not necessarily fared too well in the centuries that followed. Partly because his prose is very difficult. Partly because a whole generation of intellectuals came after him who insisted that it was not the man or woman in history, but it was the force of economics or social consequence that were the true determinators of history. So, we're not going to have time tonight to resolve the controversy of whether men or forces, social and economic, determine events. And I think most would say that that's in history or a combination. But the question is, where is the balance? What really tips the balance? What determines events? My argument tonight is great men and great events make great history. Yeah. Great men and women, great events make great history. Now, before we came over here, or maybe it was as we were just standing before the lecture began, someone said, another book on the Utah War? Well, a lot of work. A lot of scholars have done magnificent work on this great event called the Utah War. And we'll try and explain what that event was as we progress tonight. But there's always room for another perspective. And I would like to present to you the perspective of drama this evening. For it seems to me that a case could be made that there was perhaps no event in 19th century history, and perhaps not even in 20th century or 21st century, that gathered on the historical stage so great a collection of unusual men and women that might be called heroes. Remember, these are individual people who are creating great events. Here is a personal dilemma in my writing. I start writing a book on Brigham Young as a biographer, and I get to a chapter dealing with the Utah War. And I fall into that. I see in that chapter events and people that other scholars have never seen before, or at least working in a combination that other scholars have not seen before. So what I need to tell you is Matt Rowe, my wonderfully distinguished, talented co-author on my forthcoming book on the Utah War, this is really a chapter in Ron Walker's biography of Brigham Young. All right, keep that in mind. It is a chapter that has been turned into a book. All right, let me set the stage. We're going to talk about three men tonight. And I'd like to put them on a historical stage before we begin. The old tabernacle had been thrown up during the winter of 1851-52, with the promise that the barn-like structure would be short-lived. Much of the interior lay beneath the plane of the ground. To enter was to descend. It was really an ugly building. The speaker's platform was on the west, and the congregation sat on the three sides, and the seats ascending from the pulpit. Brigham Young, with his careful attention to detail, calculated that the building could hold 2,260 adults if they weighed 120 to 175 pounds. And there is a biographical insight. This is a peculiar man given to a sense of detail. And the peculiar-looking tabernacle was, in a sense, an expression of this extremely unusual person who led the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. On this occasion, the first presidency was present, and 4 members of the Quorum of the 12, and there may have been as many as 3,000 people sitting in the congregation. Other estimates went as high as 4,000. President Young began with one of his familiar topics: the indefeasible right of the saints to obey the law of God. And he talked on that for a few minutes. Heber C. Kimball, President Young's right-hand man and counselor, also spoke briefly, and then the choir sang. Then the drama began. 2 men, Thomas Kane and Alfred Cumming, entered through the vestry and took their seats on the podium. Now, a originally I had planned about talking about that meeting. But I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do that. But that meeting sets on the stage the three characters we're going to talk about tonight. Another event, we could include others. We're going to talk about Brigham Young, Thomas Cade, and Alfred Cumming. We arrange their names according to their importance. Okay, my conviction tonight is great men and great events make great history. And we want to ask a question. The question is, what if? Some of you may know historians are very much concerned today with the questions of what if. Whole volumes are being written about it. It's called alternative history or virtual history, counterfactual history. But those are fancy names. Basically, what this approach is to ask the question, what if? What if Brigham Young had not been present in 1858? Or what if Thomas Cade had not been present in 1858? What if Alfred Cumming had not been present in 1858? Now, historians like to play games with this, and there could be many, many examples that we could present this evening. But let me just give you one. Captain Patrick Ferguson carried one of the first breech-loading rifles in the world in combat at the Battle of Brandywine. This new rifle could spill out 4 to 6 bullets a minute, and it was much more effective than the musket. With no idea that he had come face to face with Washington, Ferguson called the horseman and his escort to surrender. The officer shouted a warning, and Washington wheeled his horse and galloped away. Ferguson took aim and lowered his gun. He could not bring himself to shoot an unarmed enemy in the back. He was also very impressed with this man's cool indifference to death. What if Ferguson had killed George Washington? Our history would be different. Some of you will know that during the Utah War, Mormon raiders took out 2 supply trains. President Young delayed that order for weeks and continued to delay. The commander in the field, Daniel Wells, said, "We cannot wait any longer. We must stop these trains so the troops will not enter Utah in 1857, and he gave the order." The question is, what if? Our history might have been entirely different. Well, let me just give you some background, first of all, on the first of our portraits, President Brigham Young. Sometimes he seemed to live within himself. It was hard for anyone to enter into his thoughts. He kept them private. But like Carlyle's great man. He was an observer from his youth. Went to school, maybe 11 days, formal education, but he compensated by looking at people and taking their measure and thinking. He said, when I meet ladies and gentlemen of the higher rank, you must not accept the same formal ceremony and etiquette that are observed among the great and the kings on high. When he first became leader of the church, he didn't think he could do it. I have many reflections, especially when I'm alone. I sometimes feel that I have not a pound of strength left from just sitting and thinking. Well, there's this whole world within Brigham Young. It's so difficult for a biographer to penetrate. Unfortunately, there are some clues. The man was given to dreams. And he would tell his secretaries about his dreams. And there must be 70 or 80 of these dreams in the church archives. And they allow us to sense what was going on in the men's mind. Most of them are full of violence and confrontation. That I think probably reflect the hard times of his youth. He would say that his greatest enemy was always himself. All those people would gather around and annoy and confront. President Young said, "Here is my greatest enemy, the man that I have to conquer." He kept his motions intact. During the early summer of 1857, when troops were advancing upon Utah, there is just a great conflict that goes on in the language of his pulpit addresses, his sermons. Sometimes he says, I'm going to fight them, I'm going to contest, I'm done with being mobbed and driven. And then we have one of his few journals in 1857, where he says several other things. As early as the summer of 1857, he considered the general retreat of all saints, making every town a Moscow and every mountain pass a potter's field, ere the saints would permit the mob to desecrate the land that God has given us. Of course, he was thinking of Napoleon's defeat at the hands of the Russians. And then he would hesitate. If I have to fight, I wish to give my enemies fair warning, and if they will then not take it, they must divide the consequences. I wish to meet all men at the judgment bar of God without any fear to me to accuse me of a wrong action. There's this ambivalence that's going on. All during the winter of 1858, with armies poised on the borders of Utah at Camp Scott, in present-day southwest Wyoming, the question before the Mormons were these. Do we attack in a punitive strike? Now, some of you will dismiss this as something never before expressed in church history. That the Mormons were actually thinking of an attack upon the soldiers, 2,000 of them, Camp Scott. Or should we fight a defensive war? Or should we just simply leave and abandon the sentiments? Well, I don't think a man's true virtue is worth anything until it is put to the testing point. And these events in 1858 surely tested President Young. Well, there's a great story here. We can't tell it all. We can't tell much of any of it. But there was a council meeting held on the 18th of March, 1858, in which all the general authorities that were present in Salt Lake City attended, and all the militia leaders of the Utah militia. The questions were, do we strike, a punitive strike, preventive strike? Do we fight defensively? Or do we simply leave and abandon? Those were the issues. And 2 days after that meeting, the Council of War, one of the great movements of Mormon history occurred. What were this preached at the conference center? That Mormon history was taught, and there certainly was not anything more dramatic than what happened in the middle of March 1858. Because President Young called the saints in council, and he announced that there would be no preventive strike, there would be no defensive war, if possible, and the saints would just simply leave their homes. Now, in the next several months, all the inhabitants of northern Utah, including those in Salt Lake City, moved south. It was a dramatic evacuation, and one of terrible suffering and consequence. There was that one ribbon of road that extends from Salt Lake City south. And all the saints had to march on that road, first in the winter, in snowstorms, then in the summer when the dust was insufferable, the flies terrible, and then they bivouacked largely in Utah County in hovels. The Atlantic Monthly described the situation as a scene of squalid misery, a spectacle of want and distress that Americans had never witnessed before in their history. According to the magazine's correspondence, more than half of the 30,000 Mormons who moved south could not be accommodated in towns. They therefore were left to find lodgings in board shanties, wigwams, mud huts, log cabins, bowers of willow branches covered with wagon sheets, and even holes dug into the hillsides. The suffering was awful. All because President Young was unwilling to fight. Now, I think we have about 10 minutes to talk about our other two characters. And we'll have to only do that briefly. Thomas King, born to a family of wealth, position, influence. But young Thomas King did not prosper. He was out in western Pennsylvania when he finally learned that there was this Mormon war going on, and he hurried to Washington. He thought the Mormons were misbehaving as old friends. They were sort of like schoolboys, he said. They had to be disciplined. And he went to the executive mansion and he petitioned President James Buchanan that he might undertake a mission of mediation. Well, I'd like to tell you a lot more about him than I have time to do tonight. But as Thomas left his interviews then he took stock of himself. His health was poor, like it usually was. There was a risk that if he went west, he would never return. He had resigned his clerkship in the federal court. His father was a federal court judge. That was his source of income. And yet, as he weighed things, he felt strangely moved, perhaps inspired, by an overwhelming influence, he said. He called it an animal instinct that he found hard to describe. He said it was the spinning of his personal wheels of fortune. Well, I think some of you will know the story of Thomas King. He comes west to the Isthmus of Panama. He lands in Southern California. He makes this terrible journey to Salt Lake City, where he tries to begin his mediation. And then he goes to Camp Scott to petition the Army. The next month was crowded with some of the most important events in Young's short career. They included the failure to persuade the commander there to accept President Young's offer of peace and provisions. He would challenge Johnson to an affair of honor, a duel, because he believed that the army there was full of swagger and disrespect. He returned from one of his negotiations to settle the camp, and a soldier fired at him at a distance of 2 or 3 steps. He claimed it was an accident, but almost certainly it was not. The shot grazed King's neck. He wrote home, he said, "These experiences seem part of a 500 of providences which seem to have on occasion specially interposed in my behalf, which gave me a hope that there might still be success for his mediation. What other less important purpose should such a stock of miracles have been spent for?" he said. Well, we have just a few minutes to talk about Alfred Cumming. Alfred Cumming is at Camp Scott, and King seeks him out. He is the recently appointed governor of Utah, and they begin to talk about what might happen. And they come down on the side of mediation rather than confrontation. Get these two parties that don't understand each other to come to terms. Well, let me tell you a little about Alfred Cumming. He is a character in and of himself. Cumming had once been a superb physical specimen who walked with rapid strides and great elasticity. But sometime during his service in the Mexican War, and recently as superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis, he had become a large, fleshy man who enjoyed good drink as well as good food. And his other appetite was talk. He would talk in paragraphs. Soliloquies. He weighed 200 or 300 pounds, well on the way to the 400 pounds that he would weigh following the Civil War. But he too believed in mediation. And I wish I could tell you more about the story of his coming to Salt Lake City and his negotiation with President Young, who did not like for one moment this new governor entering the territory of Utah. At one point he said, "Let's treat him as cold as frozen peaches." call to visit Cumming, and the two men began to find a commonality, maybe even a friendship. Cumming believed himself to be a superior leader of personality and was soon passing out his assessments. Young had surprised him. He was a man of lamb-like disposition and possessed of a superior brain, a mind capable of grasping everything. By the way, I don't think that's too far off the mark. Smith, Elder Smith, George A. Smith, had, according to Cumming, an unaccountable memory and would make an excellent historian and the #1 politician if he had a chance. That, too, was right on the mark. Cumming gave a more mixed review to Heber C. Kimball. While fierce, brave, and unflinching, Kimball might be more dreaded than all the other Mormon leaders, he said. If anyone needed hanging, it was probably him. But Cumming was absolutely irrepressible. He continued to ask Mormon leaders to grant him the right to speak to the saints and to be proclaimed governor of Utah. Banter, friendly banter becomes the norm. At one point, Daniel Wells, a member of the first president, suggested if Cummings truly wanted to solve the Utah question, he should go to Washington, get out of Salt Lake City, and argue the case of Utah statehood. Cummings replied coolly that he fancied the day that he might become Utah's senator. Well, Cumming and Kane in Salt Lake City now begin to examine all the charges that had been made by W. Drummond, who had brought public opinion to a white heat in the East, and who was probably more responsible than any other single person for the conflict between the two sides. We're looking for bad guys to juxtapose the good guys. W. Cumming or Drummond would be a wonderful example. These are paragraphs that I really need to tell you about because they are new information and I think groundbreaking. Cumming examines all the charges confronting the Mormons. He sees whether the territorial seal is intact. He sees whether the territorial papers are intact. He checks out the work of the federal surveyors whom the Mormons detested, and he found that there was fraud and incompetence involved in their work. And so where does he turn next? In his investigations, he wants to find out about the Mountain Meadow Massacre. He plans to go to southern Utah and investigate the crime. Since troops had arrived at Bridger, there had been rumors that a large and wealthy train of immigrants, more than 150 men, women, and children, had been wiped out. The Mormons were claimed by the Indians. Cumming wanted to get to the bottom of it. He wants to take a major expedition into southern Utah to make an investigation, and he was about ready to leave Salt Lake City when Daniel Wells sends a note to President Young saying Cumming is going to investigate the massacre. Well, President Young returns to Salt Lake City at his office at 1 o'clock. An hour later, he meets with Cumming, and there is the final settlement to the Utah confrontation. I don't think you'll find this written in any of the history books. My good friend Rick Turley is working on that, and maybe But he meets with the three men, Cumming, Kane, and Young meet for a final and decisive negotiation on the 24th of April. You won't find a record in church records, but Kane did keep in his little memorable jottings. There is a phrase in French that probably had to do with Cummings' distaste for polygamy. There's also a jotting there in which President Young insists in his final negotiation that he had always stood for peace. President Young tells Cumming that he would cooperate with the utmost heartiness with Cumming as to court trials, which probably had a reference to another one of Brennan's accusations that Mormons had killed people in Springville, but it most likely also had to do with investigating Mountain Meadows. President Young agrees to cooperate with all these things and to introduce Cumming publicly. And that meeting on the 25th of April had to be one of the most exciting meetings in Mormon history. And we started with that scene. For the first time, it's probably the best measure of Mormon opinion, public opinion, during the entire war controversy. Cumming presents himself, makes the big mistake of turning the meeting into a town meeting, and the saints begin to express themselves. And it is a raucous, wild, extravagant meeting that only President Young keeps under control. Well, Kane saw this agreement that had been made as a personal triumph. He said, "For once I know myself to be happy." Then, within almost minutes, there was another spinning of the wheel of fortune. The word reached Utah that Kane's father had died. Now, you see, there's a 6-week delay between events in Washington and the news reaching Utah. Kane penned these words in his diary. Eloi, Eloi, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I was struck down by the dreadful report, Kane later said. And then he shifted to the third person. Surely he would break his heart, or he would blaspheme. He received the information from President Young, who took him aside, and according to Kane, tenderly told him what had happened. All right. I have not subjected you this evening to the fuller account, which would have kept us here for another half hour or an hour. But I have tried to introduce to you how three men worked for moderation, who demonstrated courage, who sought virtue. Now, these are things that are terribly out of date in a writing of academic historians today. We started talking about Thomas Carlyle's great figures, great heroes of history. He compiled a whole bunch of them. And today they may seem a little strange to us. Odin, Muhammad, Dante, Shakespeare, Luther, Dr. Johnson, Rousseau, Burns, Cromwell, and so forth. There's also a little passage in one of his writings that's been completely overlooked by scholars, where certainly he proclaims that Jesus of Nazareth is the greatest hero of all. There was another candidate for Carlyle's pantheon, but his name was only suggested in 4 pages of folio in Carlyle's unpublished papers. The draft had many markings and crossouts that suggested that this is something that he paid a great deal of attention to. Let me quote the first words. An article on the Mormons, this is Carlyle writing, it would be worth writing if one had the heart for it. He talked about Mormonism being a gross physical form of Calvinism, gross, physical, in many ways very base. He was talking about Mormon polygamy. And Carlyle, who detested all things American, would make a remarkable statement. But in one point, this strange movement in the American West, Mormonism, is transcendently superior to all other forms of religion now extant. It is believed and practiced from day to day, from hour to hour. That is its immeasurable superiority. Now, Carlyle talked about who was this great leader of the Mormons. He calls him the successor to Joseph Smith. I think it could be argued that the greatest hero of all for Carlyle may have been a strange man in the American West who was untutored, who could be combative, who had this strong, determined will, who made things happen. Carlyle like that. All right, well, let me just conclude. Some years ago, I wrote a very slim volume on how Mormons have done their job, Mormon historians have done their job. There's a chapter on the New Mormon history that Leonard Arrington was the great mentor of. I wrote that the Mormon past and these New Mormon historians, me, Jill, Tom, we can name them all, sought a middle ground between polemical, historical literature of the past and intellectual and scientific disapproval of religion that had filled the 20th century. It was the middle way. But its tone was passive and detached. I think that's a correct assumption. So what might lie in the future? When I wrote those passages, I was befuddled, and I remain befuddled even now. But I do know this, that the great histories of the past have always asked large questions. Does God, or do the gods exist? What is the divine? What about fate or providence? President Young was a man of providence, and even Thomas Paine, a non-believer in sectarian religion, talked about the wheel of fortune. Are events simply chance, random? Or is there some kind of pattern? Our culture today quakes at the thought of being judgmental. That's become a pejorative. Are there good and evil forces at work? Are there standards? How should we live? our lives in the world today? Well, it seems to me that we as historians might want to take a look at these 1,000-old questions that have been full of our literature until the last maybe 100 years. We should be concerned with the inscription at Delphi. Know thyself. These truth words suggest an introspection as well as a force within us that allows us to stand against popular clamor and odds. Alfred Kine, Thomas Kane, and Brigham Young did exactly that. We started by asking questions of what if. What if Young, Kane, and Cumming had not been on the historical stage? Well, I, for one, can't imagine the past without them. Thank you very much. I have trespassed on your time. I've gone much longer than I intended, but I don't think it would be out of line if there may be a question or two from the audience, and then we'll get out of here. Jen, do you want to come up and help me? Any questions? Any comments? Thoughts? Yes. Todd.
What happened to Cummings' desire for an investigation of the Mount Meadows massacre?
He never pursued it. The question is, what happened to his desire to investigate Mount Meadows? He goes south the next week and he gets as far as Springville, and news comes, definitive news comes, that Kane's father is dead. There was a little uncertainty before that. And at that point, Kane, who is with Cummings, says, I've got to return to Philadelphia, and they do. So they go down to Springville, Springville. I think they make an investigation of those murders there, and because of events, they do not go further south. And I think he becomes later convinced that whatever happened there might be better left until emotions cooled. That's my guess. Yes?
What do you think might have happened if they hadn't stopped the supply train?
What would have happened had they not stopped the supply train? There would have been a war. The Army was intent on forcing its way into Salt Lake City. It certainly would have tried, and it certainly would have been resisted by the Mormons. An act of providence. Yes.
When did Brigham Young bring back the Mormons to northern Utah?
About 2 months later, and everyone was wildly happy to get out of that mess. But I didn't have time to treat this. According to Carlyle's theory, there has to be a hero, and there has to be hero worshipers. You have to have a hero, and you have to be willing somehow to have people follow that great man on the stage. The Utah War is a case study of Carlyle's theory about having a great leader and great people who follow.
I remember years ago Leonard saying so proudly that he knew definitively that Brigham Young did not order the Mount Meadows massacre. But now I read that people are saying it was Brigham Young's warmongering language. Really truly says.
The question is, was Brigham Young responsible for the massacre at Mount Meadows? My colleague here, Rick and Glenn Leonard, we tried to tackle that question in a book a couple of years ago. And our conclusion was, certainly his wartime rhetoric was a contribution. But I can tell you this, there is no leader that I know of in Mormon history that was more of a passive when he had a time to give an episode a second or third thought. This man was anti-war. And I think the notion that he might have somehow in a conspiracy caused the massacre, to believe that you simply cannot read his letters and his speeches because the whole character of Brigham Young is antithetical to this idea.
I'm from California, so I don't have to go as far. So I want to know, when Johnson's army came to Salt Lake, was Cunningham's army here talking to Brigham Young? And so that was probably the first step.
Yeah, I think things had really been all solved on the 24th of April. What happened afterwards was a postscript. I don't know whether that was your question or not.
Yeah, I wanted to know if Brigham Young and they already kind of worked out that Johnson's army came. People were still scared about what happened.
When Cummings' army marches into Salt Lake, it is a long and tedious procession that takes hours for the army to get through Salt Lake City. At the time, Brigham Young is down south, bivouacked with all these things in Utah County. So there is not the confrontation. Did you have a comment? Yes.
You've done an extraordinary job. It's wonderful to watch you paint and probe or listen to the silences and the echoes of little phrases and gestures among these three men. One of the aspects of your narrative was that upon learning from Brigham that his father had died, Thomas Kane wrote in his journal, Eloi, hast thou forsaken me? And he didn't have regard for sectarian religion.
Well, I wish we had been able to treat this. The question is, what is all this business about religious images in Kane's diary? He has...
Well, and if I may get it out so you can answer all at once, and the other element in the recipe is that Kane treats the Mormons with heroic respect and generosity. I'm wondering about what you're about to answer. What is it about religious imagery? And if you could tell us any more about his relationship with the religiosity.
The question is Kane's religiosity. The man comes back from his studies in Paris, disinclined to pulpits, pews, and preachers. He does not like standard religion, which is a tremendous disappointment to his lovely wife, Elizabeth. Prior to coming to Utah, it appears that he has some kind of religious conversion. And his letters during his entire trip to Utah are full of religious sectarian images. The news of his father's death seems to absolutely shatter this religiosity. I don't know what happens. But the first thing he does when he gets back to Philadelphia, he takes Elizabeth out and says, I'm not a believer in sectarian religion. So his attention in their lives, his attention in his life. It's an absolutely fascinating one because he records these religious images. He sees himself as a religious knight errant coming out west. In some respects, he returns from this great adventure, a broken man religiously. Tom?
Ron, in your answer to the question about what Cummings did after this time, you didn't mention that he thought that he had an agreement worked out with Brigham Young after the army had come there, that they would investigate the Mount himself that it was torpedoed by other federal officials.
Thank you, Tom. Okay. I think we should get out of here. Yes.
Okay, my great-great-grandfather's journal that I've been recently reading talks about bullets flying during this war. And I had always understood there wasn't an actual confrontation, but it sounds like there was. How long did it actually go on like that?
Help me out. Oh, the question is, was there firing in the U.S. war? There was a lot of firing on the part of the U.S. Army. Can you imagine your frustration coming out here? They did not have troopers, they did not have cavalry to protect their flanks. It was a terribly, terribly, terribly mismatched malfunction of the War Department. And so these Army guys see these superb Mormon horsemen riding circles around them, taunting them, setting fire to the grass before them. They're upset and they fire. Brigham's standing orders were, do not return fire. Do not shed blood.